David getting the 80th and the 80th birthday, so I think I'd take a lotto ticket if I was you, David. Anyway, look, tonight I'm going to introduce Jennifer Farrer. Now, I'm going to speak in the first tense rather than... So it was, when I was growing up, it seemed that everyone in my extended family was an enthusiastic gardener. My parents also took us walking in the bush, and so I acquired an appreciation of plants growing in the wild as well. I learned to love Australian plants from my father and uncles, and have been a member of the Australian Plant Society since the early 1970s. I also have a long-standing interest in Australian history. So these two areas come together in a topic of my talk, Australian plants used by the early settlers. The first settlers in Australia lived at the end of a very long and unreliable supply line. All the necessities of life arrived here after a long sea voyage from England, South Africa, India and China. Bush tucker had become a novel addition to our diet today, but in the early years of the settlement and exploration, experimenting with local plants for food, drink and medicine was essential. This presentation describes some of the plants which were in daily use 200 years ago. I have had careers in recruitment and training, assistance analysts, public libraries and now tour guiding. One of my current roles is to organise and deliver to Baulkham Hills Shire Council Walks program. So may we welcome Jennifer Farrer. Thank you. I think I might leave.
Well, thank you very much. I've been really looking forward to tonight, but I've also been very nervous because one of the people in the audience here tonight is Judith Dunn, who was one of my teachers at Baulkham Hills TAFE when I did the tour guide course 12 years ago. And so I always feel that she's marking me. But also here is Peter Crittenden, and he was one of the other students in the same class. And Karen McGay was in the same class, and she's not here tonight. She obviously has got something more important to do. Maybe she's away on a tour, so I'm sorry I'm going to miss her, but I do see her from time to time at tour guide at events in Sydney. So, as Ilma said, this talk is about plants, which might be a bit different because I think you probably spend a lot of your time thinking about people and buildings, but we will be talking about people as well. So, and I'm going to be talking about plants that you see here in Sydney. These are plants that you can go to Parramatta Park and see growing. You can see them growing in lots of the bush reserves around Sydney. They're not things that you've seen on TV about North Queensland or the Northern Territory. These are our local plants and they're part of our local heritage. So imagine Sydney Cove in January 1788. The shoreline was much further back than it is now. The tide limit was at present day Hunter Street. And it wasn't the shape that it is now because there's been a lot of land reclamation there and of course most bays in the harbour. So once upon a time it was shaped like a triangle. Like that. And the tank stream came down at the apex of that triangle. Now the tank stream is called the tank stream because they dug pits in the sandstone to hold the water, to make sure that there would be a continual supply of water. Now, in the 1990s there were two very large projects in Sydney over the tank stream, because it's still there. In fact, if you walk down the Pitt Street Mall, there's a little monument there in the pavement telling you the tank stream is underneath, and there's a quote from Watkin Tench. But most people just walk over it. When I stop and show them to people on tours, they're always very surprised. So the two developments that were in the 90s over the tank stream were the redevelopment of the GPO for the Western Hotel, and the building of the City Recycle Hall in Angel Place. And both those projects had budgets which included archaeological research. And one of the things that they did for both those projects was a soil analysis. Now I know it sounds astonishing, but it's true. That 200 years after the first fleet arrived, they were able to analyse the soil under those buildings for pollen. And they were able to ascertain what sort of trees and plants were growing along the tank stream in 1788 when the first fleet arrived and quickly started to pollute that stream. Now this is what it looked like. It was a scribbly gum woodland. Now this is a scribbly gum woodland not far from here. It's in Castle Hill. And you see the beautiful white trunks on the scribbly gums, and the understory, this is taken in spring when the golden wattle was flowering. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And this is a picture, once again, the same reserve in Castle Hill. This is Caddo Creek in Castle Hill, and I imagine this is what the tank stream would have looked like, because you see the large bed of sandstone in the foreground and the creek flowing over the sandstone. So what did they find growing in that creek? Well, as I said, it was a scribbly gum woodland with an understory of tea tree, banksias, callistemons, and in the very moist areas right in the valley here, there were bottle brushes, lily pillies, cheese trees, blueberry ash, and cabbage tree palms. And down at the tide limit, where the stream actually went into the sea, which was quite marshy, obviously, there were swamp mahoganies and swamp oaks, in other words, casuarinas. So I'm going to be talking about some of those plants today, and lots of others too. Now, when the first fleet arrived here in 1788, they'd been at sea for 8 weeks. They'd sailed from Cape Town, and so they had long exhausted the supplies of fresh food that they'd taken on board at Cape Town, so they were back to dry rations. Now, a healthy person can survive without vitamin C for 6 weeks. After 6 weeks, if you don't have fresh food, which contains vitamin C, you start to get symptoms of scurvy, which is a very nasty disease. And you're a historian, so you probably know about scurvy. It starts off with your gums swelling, and then your ankles swell, your gums start to bleed, your teeth fall out, and etc., etc. And if you don't do something about it, you die. And a lot of people did die, particularly on long sea voyages, and people knew about the dangers. They didn't know about vitamin C, but they knew that if they ate fresh food, they would get better. So the first fleet arrived and they didn't have fresh food. They knew a little bit about what was here from Joseph Banks, and they set about growing their own crops at Farm Cove. They planted seeds, they brought from England, and cuttings and plants that they acquired on the way in Cape Town and Rio de Janeiro. And as you know, those crops failed because it was one of the worst, they now say, probably one of the worst El Nino events that we know of. So not only were they trying to grow crops in soil that was unsuitable because it was deficient in calcium and phosphorus, but also the weather was against them. My goodness, don't we hear that a lot when people are trying to grow crops in Australia. But living here around the harbour were Aboriginal people who had been here for tens of thousands of years, 20,000 years I think, for Sydney. And they weren't getting scurvy, and they weren't dying, and they weren't hungry, or certainly not in the summertime. They were living off the land, and they had done so for thousands of years. And so the Europeans had to quickly work out how they were going to manage in this very hostile environment, trying to find plants that were going to be useful to them. And they knew nothing about the plants, of course. Most of the things were quite foreign to them, but as I'm going to tell you in a minute, some of them weren't as foreign as you'd think. But the very first thing they had to do was to stop the soldiers and convicts and the sailors from getting scurvy. Now, this is one of the things. Now, I see that Pamshon has written a book about the botanists in the First Fleet. Well, I'll be very interested to read that. Because the botanists, the surgeons in the First Fleet were mostly botanists. They were used to making a lot of their own medicines from plants back in England. They used to knew a lot about botany. And somehow they worked out that if they made a tea with the leaves of this plant, they would be able to keep the people healthy. This is bush tea, or name sarsaparilla, or sweet tea. Are you familiar with this? Do you know about this? Somebody's nodding. Season at Sarsaparilla by Patrick White is written using this plant as a name. Now this does have vitamin C in it. These leaves, if you pick these leaves in the bush and you tear them in half and you just touch them on your tongue, you'll taste the sweetness in the leaf. When you make a tea with these leaves, you've got 25 milligrams of vitamin C per 100 ml. Now, that doesn't mean anything to you, but if I tell you that orange juice is 50 milligrams per 100 ml, you'll know that it's half as good as orange juice. They worked it out empirically. They sent the convicts out into the bush to pick this by the sackload. And you can do it easily. But even today, there's so much of our bush built over in the suburbs, you can find this really easily. You know, you could walk out from here and you could find it in no time flat. And it drags itself over rocks and trees and yeah, very, very easy to find. And it makes a lovely tea. It's really quite sweet. You don't need to put sugar in it. It's called sarsaparilla because people thought it had an aniseed taste. I can't taste that myself. So that's the native sarsaparilla. And the habit of drinking that tea persisted right through the early days of Sydney into the 20th century. I've given this talk to lots of community groups and people remember their grandparents drinking it. It's unfortunate that we've lost that memory. But in the middle of the 19th century, when there were lots of ships coming bringing Chinese tea to it, and later on Indian tea to Sydney, people still went to the George Street markets to buy big bush tea leaves to make tea at home. And of course, the most famous bush tea leaves are in the State Library when they had their exhibition 100 treasures to celebrate 100 years of the State Library. One of the treasures was 2 tiny leaves of this plant. And people went into the State Library to look at those 2 leaves, whereas they could have just strolled down to the Botanic Gardens and seen them. Because they were there, because they were taken to England, they think, by Mary Bryant, and they were found in the belongings of Samuel Johnson. And they think that she gave them to him because he defended her. Now, the other plant that is mentioned in the early diaries, and that's my source of this talk, is what people said at the time, is this one. This is native currant, and this is still, can be seen growing in Sydney on the sandstone ridges. It's not as common because we tended to build houses on the sandstone ridges. But you can see them. And in the spring, late winter, they have this lovely fruit. You can see them hanging down like lots of little Christmas lights. And it's called a native currant because it's about the same size as currant, but it never goes purple like a currant, it stays green. And when you taste it, it's got a very pleasant acidic taste. It's not unpleasant, it's not too sour, it's nowhere near as sour as gooseberries, but very pleasant. And that also is very high in vitamin C. Now, the second fleet, they longed and longed and longed for a ship from England, and when the ship from England finally came, it came full of convicts. Well, there were more than one ship, of course. Came full of convicts who were very, very ill. Because the second fleet was a private enterprise, not like the first fleet, which was government provisioned. And the private contractor who brought out the second fleet had been used to running the slave trade across from Africa to America, and he only packed enough provisions to go across the Atlantic. Didn't realise it took a bit longer to get to Australia. And 164 convicts died on board in the second fleet, none died in the first fleet. And those that arrived in Sydney, they were hoping for more food. Instead of that, these poor souls arrived, they were so weak they had to be loaded on slings to get ashore. But fortunately, the pitiful survivors were restored with special bread rations and supplies of the acid berry of the country. That's from Judge Advocate Collins' diary. This is the acid berry of the country. Now, the people who arrived here in Sydney in 1788 were mostly from South East England, and when they arrived here, they saw plants growing around Sydney Harbour that they knew, because they also grew on the Thames estuary and other estuaries in England. And I'm talking about plants which are called halophytes, which is just a fancy word meaning salt loving. And this is one of them. This is sea blight, that's grown on the Parramatta River at Meadowbank. This is sandfire. Now, sandfire's making a bit of a comeback, isn't it? Celebrity chefs have discovered it, but they were eating it in 1788. Sandfire's another one. And then there's several others that I don't have pictures of, like sea celery. And because they're halophytes, they secrete the salt that's in the water through their leaves, which makes them very tasty to us because we're used to a salty diet. And the Englishmen were used to harvesting these on the water's edge back in England, cooking them as a vegetable, pickling them, and even eating them raw. And so that's what they did when they came to Sydney. But probably the most famous of the half-bites is this one. This is Warrigal greens or New Zealand spinach. This had been first sampled by Captain Cook and his crew in New Zealand, and then when they came to Botany Bay, hello, here it was again. This is not unique to Australia, it grows right around the Pacific Rim, and the seeds were taken back to England and appeared in nursery catalogues before the end of the 18th century. Joseph Banks was said to be very fond of it, but then so would you if you'd been eating on a ship's diet and ship's biscuits and salted beef. When you cook it, it tastes just like English spinach, so it's really quite nice, but not everybody likes spinach. This is not growing in the bush, this is growing in my garden. But the sad thing is, if you want to grow this in your garden, you're not going to be able to waltz down to Hargrave's nursery or Flower Power and get the seeds, because we turned our back on this natural, native produce. It's grown commercially in England, it's grown in France, it's grown in America. I sent to New Zealand to get the seeds.
It's growing along the river, just...
Yes, I know. It's growing everywhere. It's growing all along the Parramatta River, but who's ever thought of eating it? Hello?
Excuse me, diggers have seeds of that?
Oh, they do now. Well, years ago when I first started growing it, they didn't. And also, I believe that sometimes now you can buy it at Harris Farm markets because Connie Pons discovered it. And she's using it in cooking. Look, it's terrific. You can put it in quiches, in stir fries. I use it all the time. And so there you are. But the fact is, this is something that was available to us, and we were happy to eat it in the early days. Once the ship arrived with English spinach, for some reason we decided that was better than what was growing locally. Now, Englishmen in the 18th century were used to going out into the fields and hedgerows and gathering leaves and making a mixed salad. When I was growing up, the only salad was iceberg lettuce, but we have progressed a bit since then, and we do buy mixed leaf salads in the supermarket now, and that's more going back to the 18th century style. And this is one of the leaves that was used in early Sydney to make a salad. It's called scurvy grass because it stopped you getting scurvy. And I'll bet some of you have pulled this out of your gardens as a weed because it can become very weedy. It's not wandering Jew. Who thought it was wandering Jew? Why is it not wandering Jew gardens? Well done.
It's the curse of where I live because I try to get rid of it and it keeps growing because of seed. It grows by seed, and even years after it's been pulled out, more seeds still come up.
Well, I tolerate it because it's got such a lovely blue flower. It looks really pretty at this time of the year, don't you think? That's in my garden. But come the autumn, I'll rip it all out, and then more will come. But I'm a very, I say fair gardener. I don't mind things taking over sometimes. I like the greenery. So this is the popular name for this Sydney plant, scurvy grass. It actually is quite closely related botanically to wandering Jew, but wandering Jew is an exotic plant. It's a weed. It doesn't belong here. Now, we're going to go on to fruit now, but before we do talk about fruit, I just want to say that all those plants I just showed you are Europeans, white man's bush tucker. Aborigines did not eat them. They were absolutely amazed to see the Europeans eating those green leaves. I've often seen Aborigines talking about warrigal greens, but they didn't eat them. They were more interested in what grew under the ground, roots and things like that. But when it came to fruits, well, they were both competing for the same resource. Now this is native cherry. This is a plant that's common to the whole of southeast Australia, including Tasmania. And I know I've got this fancy thing to point. Oh, look at that. Now if you look, you'll see that's the seed. And this is actually the stalk of the seed, which swells to become a really fleshy, a big fleshy stalk, which is delicious, I've got to tell you. And it was highly prized in the early days, going well into the 19th century. When a district was listing the produce, they would list native cherry because people used to make jams and jellies and pies with it. And it's really quite nice. I can't say the same for this one. This is apple dumplings, and this is very much in evidence in the bush at the moment. It's another creeper, and it's all around in the bush because we've had such wet seasons the last few years. So it's doing really, really well, and you see these creepers and the little dumplings hanging down. It's like the apple roly-poly puddings. But they're actually like little kiwi fruits with a similar skin that you don't eat. But I've never been able to strike it on a good day and it tastes. I mean, it's edible, but just because something's edible doesn't mean it tastes nice. Now, this is the sandpaper fig. Now, the Port Jackson fig, that's very common around Sydney, is also edible and was eaten by the Aboriginal people, but it doesn't add up to much. And it certainly didn't appeal to the Europeans. It's exactly the same family as the figs that are usually too expensive to buy in the shops. But this one is actually delicious. This is sandpaper fig, and unfortunately these ones aren't ripe. They will ripen and become a beautiful ruby red. And this fig grows in the creeks around Sydney. It's not terribly common. This photo was taken at Brush Farm Park. There's quite a lot of them in Brush Farm Park. And it's called the sandpaper fig because the leaf is very rough, and Joseph Banks observed Aboriginal men sanding their weapons with it. He was quite fascinated by that. Now this is lily pilly. I'm sure you all know that. Who's tried lily pilly? Sweet. Yes. Yes, okay. Would anyone like to tell me what they thought about it?
Bitter. Lovely.
Bitter, lovely. There's a bit of contrast.
Just a slight bitterness,
The start of
but nice and firm.
Mm. Let me tell you what Joseph Banks said about the lily pilly. This is his diary, 2nd of May 1770, when they were at Kurnell. Ate with much pleasure, but they had little to recommend there but a slight acid taste. Who agrees with Joseph Banks?
But I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's like Nashi pear. I mean, they haven't got much taste on it. Pardon?
Makes a nice jam.
Ah, yes, well, you know why, don't you? Because you've added a lot of sugar.
No more than a pound.
I'm sort of interested that Hake's Chocolate has stopped making Lily Pilly chocolates. They used to make Lily Pilly chocolates. I think I've always wanted to make Lily Pilly jelly because I think it would be the most gorgeous colour. So that's the Lily Pilly. Now this is a flower, it's not a picture of the fruit. This is another one that was considered so good that it was actually gathered in the bush and sold commercially in the markets in George Street. This is Five Corners or the groundberry. It's called Five Corners because the fruit's five-sided. Has a beautiful flower in the winter, various colours. This one's sort of pale pink, you can get limey green, yellow ones, and also bright red, which are the most striking. And this is pig face. Who's got pig face growing in their garden? Who's tried the fruit? Don't overwhelm me. I gave this talk to the Woy Woy Crows Club a few years ago, and I said, who's got pig face growing in their garden? Because Woy Woy's right on the coast, so they all put their hands up, because it's a coastal plant. And I said, who's eaten it? And this man said, I picked it by the bucketful. And the rest of the members were really astonished. Called Beach Bananas, it's a popular name. It was a favourite of the Aboriginals, very luscious and very juicy. Next time you get some fruit, you better try it.
So what part of it do you get?
The fruit. When the flower goes, you get fruit if you've got bees. And that's why it's called pig face, because the fruit looks like a little pig's face. Now, tea. The English were a tea-drinking society by the 18th century. They got all their tea from China. It was quite expensive, but they all loved their tea. One convict woman who could write wrote home to her family and said she was dying for a good cup of tea because there weren't too many around in Sydney in the early days once they drank all the tea that they brought with them. But not to be deterred, they once again were quite used to making a brew with any aromatic leaf, herbal teas and things like that. And this is the tea, the leaf that was used to make the tea in Sydney. Once again, they learned from New Zealand because Leptospermum, the tea tree, does grow in New Zealand, and Captain Cook had already made tea with it with the tea tree leaves in New Zealand. So when they came here, they saw the same plant and they made the tea. Now this is the Sydney tea tree. It's got a vaguely lemon-scented aroma. The best tea tree to make tea with comes from the north coast of New South Wales, but that was in the future. I believe from my reading that they also used to grind up the ripe wattle seeds and make coffee. I can't imagine what it tasted like, but they did. It was called Settler's coffee. Now, the English nation was a beer drinking nation, but in the early days of Sydney, no one could afford to make beer. They needed every single grain of cereal they managed to grow to make bread. They couldn't afford to have any grain to make beer. But later on, of course, things did improve and they were able to think about making beer. So Governor King posted a reward for the first person who would be able to grow hops in Sydney, because you need the hops to make that distinctive bitter flavour in the beer. But while they were waiting for the hops and someone to get the reward, by the way, the reward went to James Squire, the malting shovel at Putney. He managed to successfully grow hops in 1803. By that time they'd been here 15 years, which is a long time to wait for a beer. So they tried this. Now this is the hopbush. There's several varieties in Sydney, and this is the one that grows in the Blue Gum High Forest, and it has these three-sided seeds here. There's another one that grows on the Cumberland Plain, and it has exactly the same seeds, and they're red, which makes them look more like hops than these ones do. But these homesick Englishmen thought these looked like hops enough, and they used them to hop their beer, and apparently for the result wasn't too bad. But once James Squire got his hops going, they soon forgot about the hopwood. Now we're going to talk about shelter. Governor Phillip was the only person to arrive with a house. There was a prefabricated house amongst the First Fleet's cargo, but everyone else had tents, and if they wanted something more substantial for the coming winter, they had to build their own. And they reverted to a very, very old building technique called wattle and daub, which I'm sure you all learned about at school. Now, wattle and daub is two processes. The first process is to wattle or weave the frame for the house. And in Europe and England, the preferred leaves, branches for weaving the frame were willows or aspens, but there weren't any of those here. But they found some very likely candidates. This one was growing in the tank stream. They found the pollen for it, black wattle, and this one, the golden wattle. You saw that in the photo at the beginning, Red Case and Reserve. They both had very flexible stems, and they were used to weave the frames for wattle and daub houses, and that is why we call those plants wattles. Wattle is a very old English word meaning to weave in and out. So they're called wattles in Australia and nowhere else because of their function. Then, after they'd woven their frame, they then had to attach the frame to 4 posts, and the posts more than likely were from the cabbage tree palms, because being palm trees, they were very easy to cut down. And they had another use of the cabbage tree palms, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the cabbage tree palms, 4 posts, you've got your frame. Then you cover it with daub, which is made from mud and lime. No lime, but there were plenty of shells from the Aboriginal middens. The midden on Bennelong Point, where the Opera House is now, was nearly as big as the Opera House. It's huge, apparently. So they burnt the shells to make the lime, and they then plastered the walls with the daub. Then they made a roof, and now, once again, being Englishmen, they made the roof from thatch. But they quickly found a much better material for putting on the roofs of their huts. Come on, you're all historical society people.
Cabbage tree leaves.
No, but no.
Casuarinas.
Yes, but what did they make out of the casuarinas?
Shingles.
Thank you. They made shingles. And lots of Sydney houses have still got casuarina shingles under the corrugated iron, or the slate. So that's the casuarina. Lots and lots of casuarinas around the harbour. This is a picture of a casuarina nut. In fact, Governor King had to issue an edict to stop people cutting casuarinas down too close to waterways, because already they were eroding, the banks were eroding because they were cutting down so many casuarinas. A well-cut casuarina shingle will last 90 years. Now, in April 1788, Governor Phillip could see that the crops that they planted at Farm Cove were going to fail. And so it was very, very important that he find fertile soil. And so they mounted what was called the First Inland Expedition, which of course resulted in them finding this place, Parramatta. But before they did that, they landed on the North Shore and they started walking through what Surgeon White called the Endless Wood. The Endless Wood was the Bluegum High Forest, made up of these trees here and these trees here, bluegums and blackbutts. And of course they were much more impressive than those ones because these ones have been grown for hundreds of years. It took two men to join hands to go around the trunk of one tree. And Governor Phillip knew that he had found a very valuable resource because England was at war with France and they were cutting down oak trees faster than they were growing. It takes 6 acres of oak trees to build one British warship. So they need a lot of timber in England, and of course they needed timber here too. So they set up saw pits on the North Shore and started cutting down the Bluegum High Forest. The centre of operations was at Killara, at Fiddles Wharf. By 1813, 25 years after the first fleet arrived, all the Bluegum High Forest on the lower North Shore was gone. But that didn't matter because there was plenty more on the North Shore, Upper North Shore and in Hills District, so they just moved up to Pennant Hills and started cutting down again. About 1% of Sydney's bluegums are still standing, they're still standing. Sorry, I've had the tour guide's affliction, throat infection the last few days. Now, I was taught when I was at school that the first export from Australia, because all these ships were going back to Australia empty, and it was very important that we find some produce to send back. And John MacArthur came to our rescue and bred all those sheep and grew all this wool, and finally we could send something back to England. Well, that was wrong. 1791, that second fleet, all those ships went back to England loaded up with bluegum timber to build warships to fight France. Now, just a few more, a bit about some of the other timber. This is a turpentine, and some of you are probably very familiar with this if you live around here, the turpentine trees, because this is the part of Sydney where you see them. And this is highly regarded because in the days when you built boats from wood, because it was resistant to the marine worm. So you could build boats and they wouldn't rot below the waterline, not for a while anyway. And you could also build bridges and docks, and there's still docks in London standing built with Australian turpentine. Now this is a very sad picture because it's jolly hard to take a picture of. This is the red cedar. The timber that they first found growing on the Sydney sandstone was jolly hard to cut down. You probably remember this story about how they cursed the British government for sending out inferior tools, which of course is wrong. There's nothing wrong with the tools. England was the most technologically advanced country in the world in those days. But they had never encountered such hard wood as grew on in that tough environment of Sydney sandstone. But later on they found a tree that had the long soft fibres that they were used to, and this was the red cedar. Now this is a red cedar, very, very thin. You can just see its trunk. Oh, I rather like this. This is its trunk here. That's a very young tree. It's growing at Rush Farm. No, it's not. Wrong place. It's growing at Darble Park in Denniston. Very hard to find a red cedar tree because we cut them all down. We even used the fence posts, can you believe that? This is a more mature one. This is growing at Stony Range in DY. And I've tried to photograph the top of the tree, and all the photos were just hopeless. So in the end I took a picture of the trunk. So you have to believe that's a red cedar. But there's very few red cedars around because we cut them all down. We probably cut down more red cedars than we cut down bluegums. And now, even if you've got a bluegum, if you've got a red cedar growing on your property, it's illegal for you to cut it down in New South Wales. Trying very hard to get the red cedar industry back, but it's probably going to take another 100 years. Who's got some red cedar at home? Lucky you. Yeah, beautiful, isn't it? Beautiful, beautiful wood. Now, just a few other household uses, because I was told that you like to have a tea at 9 o'clock, supper. So, everybody needs soap. And what do you make soap from?
The leaves of the mango thing.
No, not the leaves. Elmo, you've forgotten. Gil was hearing this talk for the third time.
Couldn't remember that one.
Don't worry.
Use elbow grease.
You need fat. Judah said tallow, but you need another ingredient as well. Ash, that's right. Ash and tallow, or fat and caustic soda. The caustic soda comes from ash, wood ash, and they found that the ash they got from burning the mangroves made the best soap. There's plenty of tallow, of course, because they could, once they got the sheep going, there were plenty of sheep to oil down, old sheep. So Governor Darling, he was the governor after Macquarie, and he reported that the soap made locally was of a good quality, little inferior to that received from England. Hold that thought. This is one of my real beats. Little inferior to that received from England. The settlers who came here, the free settlers, were called sterling. They had to pay their own fares out, but of course once they got here they got given lots of things like free land. The children of the convicts and the soldiers were called currency lads and lasses because currency was not as good as sterling. I suppose that currency equalled the holy dollar, didn't it? So anything locally born or anything that came from was made locally was automatically assumed to be inferior to anything that was imported from England. And I think even when I was a child, we still had that attitude. And I think it's very, very sad that it's taken us so long to get over it. And in some ways, I think it's still there. Because let's talk about something else. I haven't got a photo here because I've already shown you pictures of the black wattle and the golden wattle. The bark of both those trees was used to tan leather. We still use wattle bark to tan leather, but not the bark from those particular wattles. It's from a wattle that's native to South Australia. And you can always, or you can always tell Australian leather from English leather. Do you know how you would do that?
Smells.
No. But you're right, you're on the right track. It's a sense.
Feel?
Taste.
No. Colour. You all look like you were the age old enough to have had school bags made out of leather. Is that right?
Yes.
What colour was it?
Red.
Yeah, no, brown. Maybe brown. I was really brown. English leather's cream. See, better colour. I don't know who decided it was better to be cream than brown, but anyway, it was. Now, fibre, we need lots of fibre, lots of uses of fibre in our everyday lives. And I suspect that probably they found out how to extract fibre from the local plants from the Aboriginal people. This is named flax, Guyonella. It's become very, very popular as a landscaping plant since the weather started to get very dry. And because you don't need to weather water this, if you've got it in your garden, you don't need to worry about it. And it's very popular in public landscaping. It has a very attractive blue flower in the spring and then a blue berry. And in the centre of each leaf, see if I can do this. In the centre of each leaf, there's a leaf there. You feel that leaf, it's got a ridge of fibre going down. And so when the leaves were dry, they died and were withered, they'd be put in hot ash and then you would get, the rubbish would burn away and you'd be left with the fibre that was in the back of the leaf. And the Aboriginal women, and later on European women as well, always the women, would spin that into string. Now here in Parramatta, there was a Parramatta factory where hundreds and hundreds of female convicts went to work weaving cloth, and that cloth was a mixture of flax and wool. It was called Parramatta. And sometimes flax came from the native flax because that was more readily available. Now another source of fibre is this, the stringy bark, and I've actually got Exhibit A here. when you look at a stringy bark tree, you wonder how, I used to always wonder how the bullockys made rope from that outer bark, because it's quite crumbly, the bark outside, the bark of the stringy bark. But if you pull away that crumbly outside bark, you get this inner bark, which is a lovely long string like this. And you can easily weave that, spin that into a rope. This is a fairly small rope, so you begin. But I'll pass that around and you can have a look, because trust me, that is made from string bark. Not by me, by an Aboriginal guide that I know. There we are. Now this is a bit of fun. This is a plant that's very common around this part of Sydney. It's one of the camellias or rice flowers, and it's quite a small plant, and if you ever try to pick it, you'll find you can't, because the stalk is very stringy. And they used to use that for tying up their boots, and that's why it's popular known as bushrangers boot laces. We have plenty of bushrangers out here anyway. Now it's very hard for us who have grown up in the era of the internal combustion engine to understand what it was like to live in a society where all your horsepower came from animals, either from horses or draft horses or bullocks, and how important it was to have enough feed for all these animals that were working for you. And open areas were the most highly prized in the early days when people were looking for land. And if you think about photos of early settlers' cottages, you'll see that they're just surrounded by stumps. Cut down all the trees because they're trying to get the grass to grow so that the horse can get enough food to eat, to plough the land, take them into town, and so on and so on. So open grasslands were very, very important. And there were open grasslands, of course you know about the cow pastures and the cattle escaping and then being found in such good condition years later. This is one of the grasses that grows in Sydney. This is kangaroo grass. And it's said to be one of the reasons why Castle Hill was chosen as the site for the government farm, because there were large expanses of kangaroo grass. It's called kangaroo grass because these seed heads look like a kangaroo's paw. But the early settlers were very worried that there wasn't going to be enough grass, and so they started looking to import what was called pasture improvers to add to the local grasses. Gregory Blackstone was the first. He brought in buffalo grass in the 1820s, and lots of other grasses were brought in, and most of those are now environmental weeds, so it's a pity that they didn't leave things as they were. Now, when I first started giving this talk, people used to ask me about medicines, and I hadn't done any work about medicines. I knew about the scurvy, but that was it. So I had to do some more work. Now, there was one of the surgeons on one of the first fleet ships, and I hope he'll be in Pan's book, was called Dennis Considine. And he was very keen on plants. And he actually is the person who invented something that I bet you've all got in your bathroom cabinet.
So?
No. An Australian community.
Eucalyptus.
Eucalyptus oil, yes. No hope should be without it. Eucalyptus oil, he distilled eucalyptus oil from Sydney peppermint gum leaves. So eucalyptus oil is a local remedy that goes right back to the first fleet. But actually, coughs and colds weren't so much of a problem in the early days because people weren't living on top of each other so much. Scurvy was one of the big problems. We've talked about that. What do you think the next biggest problem was?
Diarrhea.
Yes, go to the top of the class. You get an elephant stamp. It was. I mean, let's face it, they were trying new food, all these new foods. There's a talk about a lady who, I think she actually died from eating a mess of leaves. That's in one of the diaries. She didn't just get diarrhea, she actually died. But no, diarrhea was a problem. And they decided that the best cure for diarrhea was to use the resin from the grass tree plant, which is the hardest natural resin known to man, by the way. And, oh sorry, that's the next slide. And opium. They mixed the two together and gave that as a cure for diarrhea. Now, I gave this talk to a nightclub, and there was a lady in the audience, and she was a retired pharmacist And she said to me afterwards, she said, I think the opium was probably the active ingredient. But anyway, they mixed the two. They also tried this. This is Keno. You're probably very familiar with this. The red gum has any abrasion to the bark. It starts to exude this red sap. This is Keno. It does have antiseptic properties, and people did try that for diarrhoea as well. Now this is our last picture, and it's the Cabbage Tree Path. And I guess you all know where that is, that Circular Quay. It's really terrific that they've planted the cabbage tree palms back at Circular Quay, and also in some of the other streets. Phillip Street, there's cabbage tree palms, and it's really lovely because the cabbage tree palms were apparently really common in Sydney creeks, and they disappeared really quickly. And the main reason is because they were used for building, but the other reason is because, why do you think?
Yes.
Sorry, oh, so they did make the hat, but you didn't have to kill the tree to make the hat.
That you do to eat it.
Who said that? Thank you, Judy. That's why they're called cabbage tree palms. They ate them.
Yes.
The top part of the palm, where this part here, where the leaves are coming out, that's edible. You boil it up and eat it as a vegetable. And some people buy cans of parts of palm in the supermarket. It comes from the Caribbean, and it's all very posh. But you could just eat a cabbage tree palm. So yes, they cut the palm trees down to build, and then they ate them. And then of course they did use the cabbage tree palm leaves to make the hats. So actually it's the growing tip of the leaf that they make the hats from. It's too late to try and make a hat when it becomes a full-blown leaf like that, apparently. So there we are. There were great cabbage trees back at Circular Quay, which is really, really nice. Because I only know two places naturally in Sydney where you can see them. One's the Royal National Park and the other one's Brush Farm. Someone can tell me I'm wrong. I hope I am wrong, because it's very sad that they're not around much. So that's the end of what I've got to say, and I've already gone over time, but I think we did start late. So thank you very much for having me. You can dry the leaf intensifies the flavour, but if you want to use it fresh, I mean, like if you want to make peppermint tea from the leaves in the garden, do you wait till they're dry or you just shove them in the pot? Yeah, so it doesn't matter, you can do either. But obviously if you wanted to store them, you dry them, but if you just want to make the tea straight away. When I made bush tea once on a walk, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to make bush tea? So I took along this hot water and leaves and we made the tea, but I'll never do it again, it's such a lot of work. But I did that with fresh leaves. And yeah, everyone liked it, they wanted second cups, which was very embarrassing.
Anybody else like to ask?
I just wanted to say, last Sunday my family and I did a walk along the Ponds Creek, which is near where I live. Absolutely amazed at how lush. And overgrown, of course, with had a lot of other stuff. But I'd love to take you on the walk. I'd love to have had you with us on the walk.
Have you thought about writing a book?
Oh,
very interesting.
Look, it's much easier to give a talk than write a walk. Judith will tell you that. Yeah,
it's half dead because it's...
Yeah, but not in Sydney, because it's not a Sydney native. It goes out back.
It's everywhere, all over the place. You can see it.
It's coming to Sydney, but it wasn't here in the early days.